As they were talking about the fluctuations in the financial markets, I was thinking about a study I did years ago in college about the crab fisheries in California off the coast of San Francisco, where overfishing was causing the crab populations to fluctuate wildly up and down. These big oscillations turned out to be evidence that the whole population was about to collapse. And it did collapse, except that the crab didn't disappear altogether. There were always a few out there, but there weren't enough there for to fish. And then the same thing happened further up the coast in Oregon. We started to see the same oscillations, and the population collapsed, and there were just a few there, but not commercially viable numbers. And it just seemed like a real clear analogy with what you were talking about the economic system, where we start to see these wide fluctuations and these wide oscillations. That maybe what the catastrophe that we're looking at is a collapse that isn't down to zero, but it's asymptotic. We get down to a point where economic activity at the same level just isn't possible, but will still be around in some way. How you want to respond to that?
Well, I think it's a good analogy if humans end up being as unreflective as crabs or as crab populations, and I suppose there's a degree to which that is the case, because I think people are not reflecting about these oscillations enough. And what's happened practically every time you've had a very big crisis is people have tried to do whatever they can to keep the system in place for that particular time. But I don't think, so after long-term capital, you've had massive attempts to keep financial markets intact and things like that. But we're seeing something similar with the housing crisis right now. But people are not, I don't think they're thinking about it systematically. I heard Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, speak about a week and a half ago, and the way he described the current crisis was, if you've seen a financial crisis, you've seen a financial crisis, meaning that one could not generalize from one to the other, and that each one was sort of unique and special, and there was nothing one could learn from the past. And it seems to me that that's probably not the healthiest perspective on it.
Again, far away.
I wonder if you could reflect briefly on the phenomenon of hedge investing and the rise of hedge funds and how that affects the system.
Hedge funds are very. It's a bit of a poorly defined term, since it basically just means an unregulated investment vehicle. The theory is that the standard theory is that it's helped the system because you have people who can invest and can sort of normalize various things. The concern with it is that it might make it worse because it creates sort of a false sense of security. So to sort of illustrate both, the subprime housing crisis in the U.S. over the last few years was initially created by the assumption that one could mathematically model housing in far more precise ways than had ever been done, and you could extend housing and enable people to buy it who would not have otherwise been able to buy it. But then, because everybody believed that this could be done, it led to a point where things were so far from equilibrium that the mathematical models did not work anymore at all, and you got to a much bigger crisis than you would have ever gotten had you been in a world where people did not have the mathematical models to guide them. So I think there are definitely some arguments on both sides to be made there.
I'm trying to put together the characterization of globalization, which you presented us with just now, both of you presented us with this evening, with Paul Marshall's presentation last night. When globalization, the loss of territory, the loss of boundaries, painted a very negative and frightening portrayal where you have the establishment of sanctuaries where those who were the money class who were protecting their interests and their lives against a growing number of people who are whose existence is threatened, whose culture has been taken from them, and who may potentially rise up in some kind of rebellion or engage in ceaseless war, representative. So if we take that picture of globalization against what you're thinking of as a good globalization, can you imagine a kind of globalization in which all the citizens of this planet could somehow share, in improved living circumstances, or not?
Well, all right. Well, obviously, one can imagine a version of globalization where everybody is better off, and where sort of the standard happy narrative generally does work. I think the very hard question is, how likely that is. Are we tracking towards that? Are we moving away from that? And I think it's very difficult to tell because there's so many different things you can use to point at one or the other. I suppose the one of the things that I do think is very difficult to think through is how global governance looks in a world state, and basically the trend has been towards fragmentation and towards more countries, which is perhaps good from the perspective of individual freedom and liberty, but it certainly makes it more difficult to solve some of these problems. And if that could be reversed, and if you could create a stronger world state or something like that, I don't quite know how you mitigate against the threats of tyranny and sort of turning the whole planet into a prison. So I think there are some very difficult problems. If you ask the question, we had 45 countries in 1945, we have well over 200 today. How many countries will there be in 2050? Will it be 1,000? Will it be 200? Will it be 1? And I think there are some deep challenges with all the answers to those questions. I'm not sure they're unanswerable, but that was sort of a geopolitical way I would frame it.
Yes, just to add a bit to that, I think it's a good question and a good answer. I think when we try to define globalization, we think about it as more footloose capital than was the case in the past. We've got to remember that in terms of foreign direct investment and the breakdown of tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, we're really only back where we were before the First World War. We're back to about 1913. And there's a lot more to be done in terms of seeing what freeing up these markets would actually produce. Clearly, though, some tendencies are not so much a withering away of the state as a multiplication of states, and also a more genuinely international division of labor. We've seen this obviously quite spectacularly in the case of manufacturing. No more can the sign realistically be read as saying Trenton makes, the world takes. It's more like Trenton invests somewhere else. And we're seeing it also in the sphere of culture. We're seeing it in the sphere of services. What is it that the United States manages to sell overseas, apart from aviation and military